And at the beginning of the day, you heard from Vice President Litvak, and some of you know that at the Wilson Center, we're known as not just being, a bunch of eggheads talking about all of these issues, but really being a place where policy discussions take place that lead to policy discussions that lead to action. And I think the fact that so many people have stuck around indicates that you're all here waiting for the meat. And that is to say, what are the actions that we're going to be recommending? And so we're going to be hearing from our third panel some of the very pragmatic solutions to some of the problems that we've had posed earlier in the day. And moderating our third panel is Paul Fraser, who is the president of P.D. Fraser Associates. Paul retired from the Canadian Diplomatic Corps after serving as Canada's ambassador to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. He was also Minister for Public Affairs here at the Canadian Embassy in Washington and served in other high-profile assignments in Warsaw and New York. And among other high-level assignments he had, he was Communications Director to the Prime Minister of Canada, spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's also the past U.S. co-chair of the Canada Institute's Advisory Board. So over to you, sir, for panel 3.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn. Welcome, everyone, this afternoon, and thank you for remaining with us. I would like to put the emphasis on policy that Lynn referred to. Those of us who reside in Washington spend all too much time, it would seem, in meetings where matters are passed around a table and passed around a table again, and everybody leaves the room and no one has checked to see who's going to do what. So I hope that we'll actually see some very interesting follow-up to the sessions today. Briefly, the detailed background with respect to our distinguished panel members is in the documentation that you received today. And I will introduce everyone now, and then we will do our best to get through what will be a very substantive issue, which essentially is work to be done. To my immediate left, Mr. Alan Burson, known to everyone here in the room, not only because of his excellent moderating this morning, but also because of his distinguished career in Washington and elsewhere in the United States, but very much with an insightful perspective on border issues and cross-border issues. To his left, Mr. Solomon Wong of Intervistas Consulting. To his left, dealing and who will be dealing with personal data and privacy issues, in part perhaps a continuation of one of the themes touched upon both at lunch and in an earlier discussion, but with a look ahead, Mr. John Wagner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And then a tough one with respect to an issue, forecasting growth and resourcing borders, and the view from the north. And so often in this town, we look south when it comes to border, and it's not only refreshing but vital that we also give due intention and interest to the northern border. And for that view from the north is Tina Namiasniowski, who is Executive Vice President of Canada Border Services Agency in Ottawa. And for the issue of the known traveler digital identity concept, we call on Laurie McDonald, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Safety and Security with Transport Canada. So to begin, Alan Burson, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I've got a bit of a challenge because what I'd like to do is start in 1648, and I have 10 minutes to do this. So bear with me. But I think it will actually set the stage for what really I consider the next generation of U.S. Canadian border folks. Some of whom are sitting on this panel, what the next tasks are as we move forward. But the title of my talk on the agenda is border security versus perimeter security. And what I want to do is actually go back to the notion that the future is not what it used to be, as the French poet said, and that we need to look at border security and perimeter security as part of the same package. stop looking for conflict and look for reconciliation among them. So very quickly, the Treaty of Westphalia is where we started to think about sovereignty and about borders, borders as lines that divide nations and separate empires. And basically that was when the nation state became the basic unit of geopolitical calculation and operation. And people would build borders and have their defenses, their armed forces up on the border to do protection. That explains the notion of the Great Wall of China. Borders separated the homeland from the outside, the foreigner from the domestic. And then later in the 20th century, we saw the Berlin Wall, the same phenomenon. Build fences and walls to demarcate jurisdiction, to demarcate nationality. Okay. Globalization is actually the counter of that. And what I want to explore today is the extent to which you have to look at borders not as simply lines on a map, but rather as flows, points of flow. And this depicts air and ship flows around the world, and you get a more specific depiction of global shipping lanes and global air traffic, 2,000 flights a year. But you get the point. You get the point of this being flows. Borders are not just lines going east and west, but rather flows. And in fact, in the context of North America and the United States, I'll argue that the flows have become as important as the line. We insist on the line because of sovereignty, but we actually recognize that we've got to make that line, we've got to enlist that line, that border line, on behalf of the border flows. And lastly, something that we'll take up in the context of perimeter security, the extent to which we now have electrons flowing and data flowing that are borderless, that in fact many of the flows that are taking place in today's world don't have reference to the border lines that have been defining matters since the Treaty of Westphalia. So we now look at borders as encompassing the flows of goods and people toward jurisdictional line where the national regulatory authorities assert themselves. What we faced in the context of 9/11 was a challenge in which we retreated behind the borderline and we defended it. And in fact, we had to deal with the lines that, as I indicated today, went 10 or 12 miles north into Canada and worse south into Mexico. But we solved it by reinventing the way we saw the interaction between lines and flows. In fact, we did risk management was a major change. We stopped denying that securing flows of goods and people had to be inconsistent with expediting them. And in fact, expediting lawful trade and travel was critical because when you separate low risk from high risk, you begin to be able to move the 97 to 98% of the traffic that's perfectly lawful, and you don't let the 2% dictate the flow of the border. That's when we began to see that thickening and thinning could be reconciled and in fact needed to be. The second was on Christmas Day, as that Abdul-Muttalib's attempt to blow up the Northwest airliner over Detroit, in fact he would have blown it up over Windsor, showed us that in fact we needed to see what today was referred to by Tony Smith as multiple borders. We needed to push out the borders, that in fact Homeland Security is intrinsically transnational. There's nothing that happens to the homeland that does not have a cause or an effect that's generated outside the homeland. So we needed to push out the borders, or in Dave Dinello's term, externalize the borders by actually moving our officers away from the border line. So today it should come as no surprise to this group that CBP and DHS generally has the third largest civilian footprint abroad after the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. That's the externalization of borders. We went through the expediting trade and travel, and I'm going to observe the time so that we can have a dialogue. But what I want to get to is the notion that in Homeland Security today, we actually have to look at perimeter security. And Mr. Rigby, perimeter security can be defined as you did in terms of moving it away from the borderline, but for purposes of this discussion, I want to consider perimeter security as being the geographic perimeter security. The notion that we have to look at the defense of our countries and their homelands from the context of continental security. That in the same way we created NORAD to deal with the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles coming over the pole from the Soviet Union, and we would have insufficient time to argue about who had jurisdiction, we created NORAD. We have the same threat today. When you think about the electric power grid that is integrated between Canada and the United States, and you think about the cyber threat to SCADA systems that exists in terms of hacking by state actors and non-state actors, you begin to see that we have to start thinking about the third phase of the work we're doing, and that we should recognize that the shared production platform basis of North America, unlike Schengen, we have not done away with sovereignty. We have not created perimeter security that's jurisdictional, but we have to create, and in fact, as this suggests in the context of the European Schengen, the threats and the inability to protect the continental perimeter in Europe may lead to the end of Schengen. More later on that. This is the border at Hungary now. We want to avoid that. The question is, how do we, in a time where populist politics has become central because of the pressures of trade and immigration on internal population bases and centers, how do we actually move forward with perimeter security? I want to argue to you that we've done the first phase of redefining border management with risk management. We've pushed the borders out, and now we have to get to what has been talked about a lot this morning, but is really conspicuous by its absence, except for the relationship that exists officer to officer and leader to leader between CBSA and CBP, which is we really cannot manage borders as they exist today without having perimeter security that is really joint border management. And that this involves not only coordinating a lot closer than we do already, but also involves the kind of thing that brings us continental security. We cannot deal with cyber attack without cooperating at the continental perimeter security basis any more than we could deal with defending against Soviet ICBMs. The challenge of border leadership in the next 10 years is actually to create joint border management that respects sovereignty, but recognizes that the flows are more important than the lines in the world we live in today. Thank you very much.
My name is Solomon Wong, and I'm Executive Vice President with Intravistas. And I have a dual role today. One is I've been listening intently to all the different ideas and thoughts in terms of innovations as well as challenges. And that's going to form part of the white paper to be delivered September for the Beyond Preclearance Initiative. But what I'm going to talk about today is looking at forecasting growth and resourcing borders. And a little bit of an anecdote in terms of my background. It's June 2006. And my client, Vancouver Airport Authority, has decided to lock me in a room with CBSA and don't come out until there's a business case for automated border clearance. And that very September briefed Mr. Dak Wagner in a different role in terms of some of the ideas in terms of kiosk innovation. And I think it's important to think about that anecdote because that literally is 12 years ago in terms of thinking. And I think in terms of forecasting growth, we need to take a look at what's coming down the pipe, as well as looking at the maturity of different kinds of innovations that can be brought to bear. And I think here we do have a significant amount of respect to the men and women who serve in terms of frontline roles. And if there's anything I want you to leave from my thoughts today is the number 84,000. And 84,000 represents the number of officers in 2018 processing people and goods as a combination of CBP, CBSA, Transportation Security Administration, and the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. Yes, there are other agencies involved, ICE, as well as Border Patrol, RCMP, but for simplicity, let's look at the frontline folks who are dealing with people, goods, packages for clearance. And I think that's an important thing to look at because we also need to think about it's not just 84,000, it's 84,000 plus roughly 3,000 kiosks. Kiosks provided by vendors, purchased by airports, CBP's own kiosks, CBSA with Nexus. Add them all together, it's about 3,000 between Canada and U.S. So the key question is looking forward, what do we need in 20 years? And when you look at different forecasts, and this is a multimodal view for the Beyond Preclearance Initiative, we need to take a look at DOT, look at FAA, look at Transport Canada, and others have done this. Let's do some rough numbers. Domestic, within U.S. Canada, roughly 1 to 2% per annum. It may be slightly higher as DOT's numbers showed in terms of air passengers. In the United States, was over 3% growth year over year. But predominantly, when you look at any mode, the growth is in international. It's in terms of international visitors. McKinsey did a 20 to 60 year outlook in terms of container forecasts, and it's in the 1.9 to 3.2%. Let's average that out over 20 years because we know that in the near term, growth over the past year has been more like 4 to 5%. So, think about this in terms of moving from 2 to 3 billion and plane-to-plane air passengers and extending that across all different modes. So looking at this, if you believe in the number of packages or individuals cleared per officer as a key performance indicator, you need 122,000 officers between CBP, CBSA, CATSA, and TSA by 2038. And I think nobody in this room really believes that necessarily that will happen just based on the way authorizations and appropriations occurs, unless there's a magical number that is advanced. So there's a rough shortfall of 38,000 staff to deal just with growth. But I think it's important here to look at some of the measurements in terms of what do you deal with this. So if you look at 38,000 as a shortfall, well, clearly you need a better process. Kevin Burke started us off in terms of looking at 51 passengers per hour in terms of what's been done with automated passport control. That's impressive. That's a significant increase in terms of capabilities. And similarly with pick kiosks on the Canadian side. But let's pay close attention to some of the early results from places like Miami that have put forward entry biometrics, reportedly 10 passengers per minute, 600 per hour in terms of clearance, more than tenfold increase. And I think that improvement in terms of productivity is especially important for our collective businesses, whether you're on the government or transportation side of things, because it does two things. One, it deals with growth. Now, I didn't say there was going to be 10 times growth, but we know in this business that we have a dynamic and asymmetric threat environment that will continue to challenge us. It could be contagions, it could be other threats. So buying more capacity and capacity for clearances is important. The average border officer in North America processes 10 to 40,000 passengers per year. That number has to go upward in order to be able to deal with unpredictable issues. So there are three things that we're looking to think a little bit more, and we definitely welcome everyone's input into this, in terms of number one, harnessing new ideas. Now is the right time, as we're starting to see the emergence of automated trucks, that we need to work with freight liners, the Ubers and others in this space to design what is free and secure trade, CTPAT, Nexus, trusted travel program. What does that look like in future, built right in? And that could very much be dealing with automated drones taking packages across borders, automated vehicles and other kinds of technologies, to do more with less, removing duplication. And it's not necessarily duplication between countries necessarily. I mean, that is part of it. But it's also looking at what can we actually do between modes. One example, in listening to Laurie Trauman talk about some of the things going into pilot projects, well, wouldn't mobile passport control or the CBSAE declaration app be something that could also be geared towards other modes of transportation? One of the challenges that we still have with RFID in place is that unlike other modes of transportation in cruising or for airlines, you don't really know who's coming at you at the land border. And then lastly, building near-term wins. I think in order to spark the generation of changing the way we actually look at capacity is being able to ensure that we have a platform that can be built, is privacy protected, built privacy by design, in order to make sure that we do have a platform that can help our public sector agencies, as well as the innovation that can be advanced in transportation providers, whether it's airlines, airports, cruise lines, trucking, to be able to look at this. So in closing, the ability for us to look forward is we do need to plan for the next 20-year vision for growth, and growth in terms of the number of volume of people and goods that are crossing borders. We do want to avoid the shortfall of 38,000 officers, and there may be other things that happen that will increase those numbers in terms of human factors that will be needed to help with processing. But whether it's screening technologies, decision enablers, further removing manual processes away from the true value add of being able to help manage risks. And then lastly, we do need to create successors to Fast, Nexus, and Innovate Ahead, whether that is levering emerging things like blockchain or paying close attention to the kinds of things that may cross between different modes of transportation. Peace Bridge was raised earlier as a great place for being able to do more. Now, it still remains one of the few places where the Nexus card is actually the device used to help pay for tolls going across the bridge. So there are a number of dual use things across modes that could be levered to be able to do more with less. So in closing, look forward very much to our discussions, not just here, but over the next couple of months as we put together some thoughts and ideas into the white paper that will hopefully be able to serve with whatever the successor of Beyond the Border will be, and certainly other ideas that will help further private-public partnerships. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, John Wagner from Customs and Border Protection, and I won't take you all the way back to 1648, but Let's go back to 1996, 2003. U.S. Congress passed a couple pieces of legislation requiring the tracking of visitors to the United States, both biographically and biometrically. Biometrically, it was easy to, not easy, but it was fairly simple to develop because we already had a process that we could leverage and just build upon. But when we look at the departure piece, historically, we've never really restricted departures from the United States. There isn't a separate process, much like in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world, where you go through a border control or an immigration officer to depart that country. So as you know, international flights commingle with domestic flights. So where do you implement a biometric collection within this process? And, quite frankly, DHS struggled with coming up with a reasonable approach on how to do this. And, they looked at it, the typical government approach is you get a project and, you take this parochial approach where you try to build it from the ground up and you really don't cut across everything and look at things that you're already doing and look at leveraging a lot of the pieces that are already in place. CBP took this mission over in 2013 and, we looked at efforts in the past and you could build a kiosk and you can make people report to it, right? But then they got to find it, and then you got to teach them how to use it, and then you got to hope they got enough time to get to their plane. And you look at all the different things you have to do to go through today to get from the curb to the gate and get on board that plane, and all the different places where you have to stop and show a piece of identification or some piece of paper or something on your phone to get through all the multiple gauntlets to actually get on that plane and go to your destination. So when we took this over, we looked at this and, said, well, rather than, again, take that typical government approach and go out and purchase 5,000 things and nail them to the floor and make people go through it and hide behind the legislation that said, well, Congress required us to do it. Here it is. Foist it on the travel industry and the stakeholders and say, okay, you guys figure it out now. If it takes 4 hours to board the plane, well, too bad. That's not my problem, right? This is the law that Congress passed, and this is what you're going to have to do. We looked at it and said, we can do a lot better than that, and we can come up with a much better process to do that. And we looked at the fact that we've already got information on people. We're already vetting it. The airlines are already providing us the biographic information on who's on the plane. They're already feeding us the manifests as people print their boarding pass. They already give us access to the reservation data. We've already identified all the people we have concerns about, and we're there at the gate waiting for them. And you look at the biometric collection, and a lot of the estimates in the past and a lot of the work done in the past looked at it from the perspective that you would have to collect a biometric and adjudicate the results in real time on the spot. And that's simply just not the case because we've already done all that work. And we really didn't have a way to connect it back to the passenger in real time and get them on board the plane. So the real feature of the biometrics is making sure that traveler who's actually getting on the plane is the person we've already vetted and already done our checks against. And could you do it in a way where we're actually not reading a token, not reading a passport, not reading a boarding pass, not reading any piece of identification to do that? And we thought about this and said, well, because the airlines tell us who's on board, what if we go into our systems in advance and pull out the biometrics and stage them someplace else and only rely on that much smaller group of information to search against in real time? Could a biometric work like that? And I think you heard from Colleen Manaher this morning about facial recognition and how this fits in. And we looked at it and we said, could we simply take a picture of a person without reading any identification up front and send that picture into that small group of pictures that we've set aside, right? So on a plane, maybe you have 1,000 pictures of the people on that plane. It's a lot quicker to search against that than the billion of numbers of photographs that we have. And if we did that, how quick could we make it work? And what we found out, it'll work in 2 to 3 seconds. A person can walk up, take a picture, search against that subset of data we've put aside, and we can identify who that person is. So we had an idea that this could be a very viable way to do biometric exit. All the law enforcement work has already been adjudicated in advance, right? That all goes on today, and that all goes on. It's separate, but this is a way now to connect it all in a very simple way. But we knew for this to be actually feasible and for this to actually work in real time, We just can't focus on that subset of the visitor population, right? Because then you get to the boarding area of the aircraft and you look at how do you separate out who's in scope and who's out of scope of biometric exit? And whose responsibility is that? Is it CBP's? Is it the airlines? Is it the airport authority? How do you actually do that? And how do we build a process where we could work with the airlines and say, we're not going to impact your boarding process, and we can build a system that's compatible with how you do business, how you actually board people on the plane, right? And this is where the privacy discussion comes in, because we have the photographs of all the U.S. citizens, right? U.S. citizens have already given their picture to the Department of State for the purposes of international travel, and it's put on their passport. We have an electronic copy of that database, so why aren't we using it to compare people against? And if we put everybody on that flight into this gallery that we've built, could we then just simply line up everybody on that plane and just take their pictures as they're boarding and confirm them very quickly so we're not impeding the airline's boarding operations? And if we take it a step further, could you actually work it in and replace the boarding pass so you don't have to show that piece of paper or the code on your phone to be able to do it? This way it's not a two-step process, and we haven't injected a whole nother gauntlet or a whole nother set of requirements to actually get on board the aircraft. So we have different authorities that we could leverage. True, U.S. citizens are out of scope for the biometric exit requirements, but as CBP, we still have the responsibility to ensure that person is a U.S. citizen. Just because they're waving a U.S. passport at us doesn't mean they're the true bearer of it. And who figures that out? Whose responsibility is that? You know, could we do that, and instead of manually someone looking at that document, like is done today, could you just take their picture and only compare them against that picture on the passport? And that's what we built, and I think that's what Colleen talked about this morning, that we're able to identify a person in about 2 to 3 seconds. By the time they step up to the camera, takes their picture, a green light comes on, and they can board the plane. In the background, we've taken care of the biometric exit requirement, and a couple of the carriers that we've been working with, it's facilitating the boarding process because you can board the plane a lot quicker. There's different ways this can be done. Lufthansa just went out with a press release last week, talked about some gates that they put in, and they boarded an A380 in about 20 minutes, in about half the time. And you know what? In the back end, all your biometric exit requirements were taken care of. We actually sped up the boarding process. So we start to look across the entire airport, and any place you stop to have to show an identification or some type of token to proceed to the next gauntlet, why not just take a picture and ping our database, because the data's there. So you look at TSA, you look at could we support different airline services. Now there's a lot of privacy requirements we've got to go through to do this, but for self-tagging checked bags, access to the duty-free store, there's a whole host of possibilities that we can build this, because the data's already going to be there. So why not work through the privacy requirements to make it available to travelers who want to take advantage of this? And in our discussions with a lot of the privacy groups, you know, we look at what's required by the government. You know, there will be required steps in this. But are there services that we can tack on using the same system that people can opt in or choose to do that? We've got a responsibility to notify the public that these are the required steps, here's the optional steps, here's what your data is, where it's saved, where it's collected, how long it's kept, who's it's shared with, and how you can opt in or opt out of different steps of this. And we'll be working on clarifying that and issuing a lot of information for people so they do that. But at the same time, we're looking for, you know, partnerships out there to start to leverage, really to make it easy, again, to get from that curb to the gate without actually having to show a token to do that. We're going to turn it around. We're going to use it on arrivals too in the U.S. And we're really going to make it easy for people, because once your fingerprints are in our system as a visitor, we're never really going to have to take those fingerprints again. We can match you through the photograph, and the fingerprints all run in the background. So you think about how quick this process can become. With our pre-clearance airports in Canada, you know, we have to look at the traffic flow through there and the different breakdowns of people and who we have biometrics on and who we don't. But I think the solution's there. The data's all out there. And again, the secret is in stringing together the different pieces that are already out there and not creating a whole new requirement. So look forward to your questions and discussing it further. Thanks.
also my turn. And I'm very conscious that all the hard questions that will come to me at the end, I'm going to pass them over to Vincent. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I've been listening intently to the various presenters, and I think that, you know, some of us has been around these border issues for a long time. And I'm thinking of some of the people in the room that, you know, would remember kind of where we were back in the days of the, you know, initial border accord, and then, you know, the smart border declaration or whatever it was called, and then the security prosperity partnership, and then beyond the border, and then some of the incidents that happened in between, you know, 9/11, the underwear bomber, I remember that well. I think we find ourselves at a really interesting place and time in terms of the evolution of, you know, border and border management. I think today we have opportunities to really think about how we deal with those issues, Solomon, that you raised. You know, at CBSA, we're very, very conscious because we're living the dream of what it means to be able to respond to, you know, changing demand and how that demand is growing exponentially. And I'm sure you talked about it this morning, but, you know, for sure in the air mode, you know, big increases, e-commerce, you know, off the charts. Our land border, you know, the growth hasn't been as you know, steep, and in some cases actually decreased, but that's very much dependent upon, you know, the reality of the Canadian dollar. And, you know, our ability to attract U.S. tourists to Canada. But I think we're now at a really interesting point in our evolution because we have the potential to use technology that has never existed before, in the sense that that technology didn't actually exist. And I'm thinking of the reference to, you know, data, and Alan, you made reference to, you know, we've done what we need to do around data. In our case, we haven't done as much as we would still like to do. So I think for us, you know, risk management remains very much a priority, and our need to focus on making maximum use and getting maximum value out of the data we have continues to be a priority. I think the, you know, the reality around that technology, as I said, it's something that we're very focused on, and sort of joint border management continues to be a priority. So I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of that as a backdrop, and then I'm going to throw a few things at you because, you know, as you think about beyond preclearance, we're thinking about that too, and I want to share a little bit about the Canadian context. So as I mentioned, you know, for sure we have increasing volumes. Security risks continue to be a reality for all of us, and, you know, the better we get at preventing things from materializing, the better people become at being creative around how to get around things. So that's a sort of constant reality for all of us. But that means that we have to be innovative in terms of the way that we maintain sustainability and border management moving forward. And I think, you know, we also have big expectations on the part of industry, as well as on the part of, you know, the traveling public around how it is that we manage the border from a service experience perspective. And I don't think that is going to change. And I think our success is very much dependent around, you know, how we're able to adjust to this constantly evolving environment. I said, you know, volumes are up. Let me just give you a couple of sort of stats. Between 2012 and 2017, in Canada, from the point of view of air travel, we're up by 25%. Commercial traffic up by 27%. Postal up by 151%. Courier up by 10%. And asylum claimants is up by 52%. So, you know, increasing demand in terms of our ability to process people effectively, people and goods, both from a security and an economic facilitative point of view, remains a reality for us. And I think, you know, some of the realities are, you know, we're seeing things, and it's an issue here in the United States also. You know, we're seeing new threats materializing in terms of, for example, fentanyl. You know, that wasn't something that, you know, we were experiencing 10 years. There were other drugs, but, you know, now we're seeing, you know, kind of new demand for different types of substances that unfortunately are wreaking havoc in terms of the impact socially on our two countries. So I think it's something for us that remains very much, you know, kind of something that we need to focus on and continue to focus on as we move forward. So we're really thinking about, you know, how do we get to a lower touch experience? You know, the reference to biometrics. You know, I think, Vincent, you made reference earlier to how, you know, some of the work that we've done from a border perspective has been around coming up with standard around biometrics. We're actually not quite there yet, But I think, those are some of the technologies that will enable us to think about the border differently. I think we know from a Canadian perspective that we have to get and think about the border differently, because we just do not have the ability to, we'd love for the government to continue to throw more money at us. The reality is, so would everybody else in the in the federal system, and choices are made by governments. And when you have such a sort of direct link between volume and budget, that becomes difficult, increasingly difficult for governments over time. So we have to find a way to really decrease the cost and the cost curve in terms of our ability to manage that, our business. So we're really thinking about, risk-based compliance in a different way. There was reference made to, a lot of the people that are crossing the border, want to do the right thing. We think that as well. And the reality is, though, there's a lot of misinformation around how you and what you should be doing when you're crossing the border. And if we could actually do some more work in the space of ensuring that we're working with industry, or we're working with the traveling public to make sure that they really understand the rules of a game around compliance, we think that would be helpful. We also recognize, though, that we need to do better at really, as I said, using the data that we have within our that we have within our holdings. We collect a lot of data, and I'm very conscious of the privacy implications associated with that. We have a privacy commissioner who had worked in the field of national security, well versed in sort of the realities of our business. But I can tell you, he is very much an advocate of all departments and agencies that work in that world, making sure that we protect the privacy of Canadians and others that are crossing our border. But we know that we have to find a better way of linking the data that we have. We want to have an approach where it isn't just, as I think our president likes to refer to, Groundhog Day. Every time you come across the border, it's like we've never seen you before. We want to have a way of really determining that, you've come across 25 times in the last, 2 years. You were highly compliant every time. We really don't want to be, focusing on you, and I'm sure you don't want us focusing on you either. Although I might say to my friend from transport, Katz has stopped me 3 times in the course of the last 2 visits I've made to the United States.
They're very thorough.
But, yes, it is irritating. But I think, the reality is we really do want to get to the point where we have a better sense of who's traveling and make full use of that data, so that we're really focusing on those people that we don't know. And obviously there's always kind of that random, which I guess I suffer from a lot, that random reality of pulling people out of the line. I think the other thing is, as I mentioned, taking advantage of technology. Reference, Solomon, to PICs or kiosks. We'd like to move to the world of, like right now, we're getting huge benefits out of PIC. Although I'm very conscious of our colleagues from Toronto, where in some ways our kiosks have enabled us to put a great number of people in a really short small space, and they're not moving as fast as we might like. But they have actually generated for us the reality that our border officers now are doing way more enforcement in the Toronto airport than they ever have before, because they're not standing behind that counter checking people's passports as they go through. They're actually out roving, and from a behavior perspective, they're picking up way more people around enforcement, which is actually a really good thing. So we see that as a huge benefit. But at some point, we'd like to move beyond kiosks, and this is where pushing the border out and really having a sense of who's coming, and is that person, from an identity perspective, the person that we think is coming, and that we've done all of the checks as early in the travel continuum as we possibly can, so that we're basically doing a very light touch, if any touch at all, physically as that person is coming across the border. I'm conscious of the time. I think there are things that we are continuing to build on from the point of view of some of the initiatives that would have already been announced in the context of, the broader border agenda. We've got a couple of projects that we continue to advance, some on the commercial side, including our, assessment and revenue management initiative, which from the point of view of, customs brokers and commercial carriers, there'll be great advantage from the point of view of our ability to, more seamlessly and quickly share data. Cargo preclearance, Vincent mentioned it, something that our minister is super keen on, and is something that we're continuing to advance. We're looking at remote processing also, where again we're taking advantage of technology, and we're also working. And Alan, your reference to that, joint border management from a Canada-U.S. perspective. We actually have quite a robust agenda with our colleagues at CBP, but we're also collectively working together in the context of our Five Eyes community, and very much focused on making advancements together and doing things like landing on a shared biometric standard. In terms of some of the things that in that context of that Five Eye community, e-commerce continues to be huge. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, Solomon, you referenced that, biometrics, blockchain, digitization, data analytics. So I think it's safe to say that, we are, from a CBSA perspective, looking to the future, really thinking about how do we capitalize on the data that we have, how do we capitalize on, some of the technological opportunities that exist, and how do we continue to work together, both bilaterally with the United States, but also multilaterally in the context of the broader Five Eyes community, because I think we all recognize that there are great advantages to making sure that we're, raising our collective game in the same way to the extent that's possible, because we also know that as people start to move around the world, whether it's commercially or, legitimately or even illegitimately, that there are real advantages to making sure that we're working at this together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. There's advantages and disadvantages to going last. In this particular case, it's going to work really well for me, so thank you to whoever did that. I do want to start off by saying, just to Vincent's comment at lunchtime about the weather, I want you to know that we did not bring this cold weather with us. It was here when we landed, so that's a disclaimer on the weather part. So I'm actually not going to flip through a deck, but I am just going to make some comments because I am conscious of the time and I do want to give opportunity for questions. But first of all, to say that, just Alan, thank you so much for starting off with the walls comment, because what I'm going to talk about really is going to be the opposite end of that. And so it was a wonderful beginning for me. So thank you for that. And to Solomon on the growth and resources, again, it fits very well into these comments. And John on the biometrics is just a perfect part of the conversation today. And to Tina on the traveling public and the service we provide is a lot about what we're thinking about right now. So I just want to start off with saying three really broad themes. The first is whether the current approach to passenger screening is sufficient to address today's operating challenges and future threats from a policy perspective. And to Tina, I'm sorry you got randomly searched 3 times. And to my colleagues here that are traveling back, if you get randomly searched tonight, you're welcome. The second one is what role should private-public partnerships play in addressing emerging issues and challenges. And we heard about that this morning around private-public partnerships, and I'm going to talk about one today that we're quite excited about. And then steps Transport Canada can take to ensure a modern and flexible aviation security program backed by a strong policy and regulatory framework, as well as efficient use of technology. So you can see, even though we didn't chat ahead of time, there's lots of synergies going on here in terms of the issues. So just challenges. People have thrown out numbers here today, and I'm going to throw out some numbers as well, really big numbers. So the International Air Transport Association expects 7.2 billion passengers to travel by 2035. So to Solomon's point about the growth in numbers, is really important. It's a near doubling of the 3.8 billion air travelers who traveled in 2016. So that's how fast things are moving and growing. The World Economic Forum further estimates that cross-border travel will reach 1.8 billion arrivals by 2030, compared with 1.2 billion today. So those are really big numbers that we're dealing with. So obviously, innovation is a theme of the day, because we have to adapt and change our approaches to be able to respond to that kind of traveler number. So the evolving technological landscape, a big issue we heard about today. Shifting demographic expectations regarding air travel. So over the coming years, travelers will be more digitally savvy, willing to share information to facilitate travel. We only have to look at our children and the use of what they do in terms of technology and their almost immediate expectations in terms of a response of some capacity, whether it's through a service provider or a friend. But then against this, we have this backdrop of risk and threat, this threat environment. And for us, it's constantly changing, so we have to adapt all the time. Terrorist groups continue to innovate and apply lessons learned to perpetuate acts against us and against civil aviation in particular. Threats to aviation security will continue to evolve as those technological advancements evolve. So as we're thinking of the next new thing, so is someone else thinking about how to counteract that or respond against us. Terrorists also recognize the activeness of soft targets. So we see queues lined up at airports. We often see that that's a really good target. So if we have this increase in volume in terms of air traffic traveler, we have longer queues. We have to do something to actually be able to respond to that. So in facing these challenges, how can we balance the use of technology to address new threats, but also to reduce vulnerabilities, but also to come back to the traveler point that Tina was making around how do we make this actually a better experience? So these are all complex issues layered on top of each other that we're trying to address through some innovation. So on the issue of private-public partnerships, from a regulatory and policy perspective, the current aviation security paradigm, which treats all passengers largely the same, will be a challenge for our traveler demographics. We have to change that. Airports and airlines are increasingly applying new technologies and processes to facilitate passenger progress through airports. So electronic gates we heard about, kiosks we heard about, biometric validations, procedural innovations, leveraging passenger access to mobile technology such as smartphones can all enable that seamless progress. So we're looking at solutions. So we're very fortunate over the past little while to be working with some partners on this, on a particular pilot. I'm sorry to use that word. I know that it was tossed around today, but on a particular pilot project that we're calling Known Traveler Digital Identity. And this known traveler digital identity is an example of this shift. It's a project that Canada has been working on with the World Economic Forum and the government of the Netherlands. So this is a really great example where you have two governments that are going to come together and work with private industry to try and make this happen. The role of the World Economic Forum is to create public-private partnerships to drive change and technological uptake across sectors through systems initiatives. Our minister announced this. Our minister is actually the steward of the World Economic Forum mobility system, and this was announced in Davos back in January. The technological concept at the center of this project is what's called a known traveler digital identity. The acronym KTDI essentially is a digital token, and this could include biometric information, personal information, government information, traveler data, among other data sets, which only the users can identify. And we're actually working with CBSA, Public Safety, Immigration and Refugee Canada, a number of government departments to work on this together to actually make this a success. Using the KTDI will be for the passenger to share specific pieces of information with stakeholders in their travel continuum in order to facilitate their progress in their departure. So it's a very voluntary type of project where I upload my information on a token about what I'm doing, where I'm going, where I'm staying, my traveler information in terms of my flights, and it will allow me to go through the system in a seamless way without having to stop and be reassessed and validated throughout the air travel continuum. This obviously will give us significant efficiencies in terms of things like queues, like waiting, like assessing, reassessing, moving away from the one-size-fits-all from a risk assessment perspective and a security perspective to actually allow the flow of a traveler, a trusted traveler, through the system in a very efficient, effective, technological kind of way. So it's a very challenging, complex pilot project. We're in the very beginning stages of talking to the Privacy Commissioner, obviously, in terms of in terms of this project, but we're also working very closely with industry and with the World Economic Forum and the Netherlands to make sure that we're able to start a pilot project by later this fall that we'll look at advancing first with one country and then with other partners that we're already actually in conversation with as we go forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to each of our panel members. In the interest of time, I'd like to allow for brief conversation here at the podium and then provide brief time for questions just prior to going to our final panel discussion. Alan, if you don't mind, I'd like you, if you could take very briefly a moment to give us a little bit of a sense of how this NORAD security idea has been received among folks you've met with.
So let me say, Ambassador, that Schopenhauer said every truth passes through 3 stages. In the first stage, it's ridiculed. In the second stage, it's violently opposed. And in the third stage, it's regarded as self-evident. You know, when I first mentioned the notion that NORAD, which was required because of the time and space issues of ICBMs, was implemented, no one could have imagined that a Canadian general officer would have been in charge of air defense the day of 9/11. What I really have in mind is the point's been made repeatedly today that joint border management, cooperation across the Westphalian border lines and across the Westphalian governments is really required today, that there's not a lot further than we can go. You've seen some extraordinary ingenuity, but we need to start thinking really outside the box, literally the geographic box. So let me give you a couple of examples. There will come a time within the lifetime of perhaps not mine, although it should, in which a CBSA officer will be in Frankfurt clearing passengers into North America. When you think about what John, Tina, and Lori have discussed and the numbers that Solomon has talked about, we're not going to increase CBP by 50% over the next 10 or 15 years. Not going to happen, absent some dramatic changes in public-private partnerships. So I think you can actually start thinking about pre-clearing, but doing it on behalf of North America. The data exists, and we can work through the privacy issues. We have the privacy accords, and we can work through them in ways that'll permit that. The second, we have to do this with cargo, and we can do it with cargo, with data analysis and with screening. But the fact of the matter is we've pushed too far on the borderline, and we really have to enlist time and space, and we have to enlist cooperation without giving up sovereignty. Now, everyone will retain the ability, as they do in NORAD, to make decisions that they have to, but we'll actually have a system in which we will have a harmonized approach, because we can't go any further unless CBSA, CBP actually lead the way for agencies like FDA to actually overcome the problems of the single window. John, this may sound peculiar, but I think I've come around to the view that CBSA will be an easier ally in building through those bureaucratic battles than actually trying to do it within the American government. But we have to create the framework in which that discussion can take place, and that's what the NORAD border is all about.
Well, your remarks are welcome for me personally, in particular because I recall my years at the embassy. If we used the word harmonization at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, if we talked about extending the perimeter out for security reasons, post 9/11, extending it out, there were people certainly in the public discourse that would be highly critical of anybody in the government of Canada who spoke like that in those days. So the trust, the relationships, the building blocks that these people and their predecessors and presumably their successors will engage in will make these novel ideas closer to reality, certainly the best aspects of those ideas. I'd like to touch upon biometrics, if I may. Each of you, in your own way, dealt with the issue from different perspectives. We've heard about how introducing biometrics for departures at airports has worked very, very well. I'd like to know about, because we have some very strong representatives of land border areas in the room, how will this work, and are there pilots underway now with respect to citizens and non-citizens departing either country but using biometrics? I think U.S. legislation provides for it, but I'd like to, if we could just go seriatim. John, you may start if you wish.
Sure. I mean, we're looking at similar concepts for the land borders as well. You know, as we look at building a gallery of, say, frequent crossers, you know, if we look at you know, known crossers in a location, you know, what we're experimenting with is how big can that gallery get, where you start to degrade either the match rate, the quality, or the time it takes to get the response back. You know, can it be 50,000, 100,000, 200,000? And, you know, as these algorithms get stronger and we learn, you know, better ways to use them, I think we'll get there at some point. As far as the capture device, though, to actually capture an image of a person to be able to match against is really where a lot of the challenge lies right now. Pedestrians are easy because it's a controlled environment. In a vehicle where you might have 2, 4, or 6 people, you know, the camera technology is getting better. As it looks, it can go through tinted windows and capture a picture that's of enough quality. So we'll be testing some cameras in that. You know, look at, you know, what kind of responses we get to do that. But I think, you know, we'll set the private sector on a challenge. And I think we've got the enthusiasm, you know, behind it now. And you're seeing a lot of that innovation take shape because there is going to be a use case for it. And I think you'll see the best and the brightest start to develop this type of technology to do it. We're going to look at, you know, body-worn cameras for an officer. You know, right now they're big, bulky devices because they do a lot of processing on the camera itself. And, you know, we're looking at simple ways just to capture somebody's face, extract the image, and put it into our database. So the cameras are getting better and lighter. And, you know, as you look at the flexibility this now offers to how we conduct the operations and where we do it, that's really going to drive a lot of the innovation in how we do it. So it's part the back-end matching systems and part the hardware of the cameras to be able to capture that. But I think we've got a lot of energy and enthusiasm out there, people, you know, willing to build new ways to do this. So we're pretty excited about what the future holds for truck drivers. You know, we look at, you know, rather than queuing off the cargo transaction by typing in the license plate or reading the RFID from the card, we already know who the drivers are going to be. So why not have a camera out there that captures the driver's face, and that triggers the cargo inspection. And as we look at new non-intrusive inspection technology, you know, like a train can go right across the border and we image all the cars without it stopping. We're looking at ways to do the same thing with a truck. You know, you have a low energy system on the cab and the driver, and then a high energy system on the cargo itself, so it can bypass right through, you know, with slowing down, but not actually having to stop and have the face trigger the cargo transaction as it comes through. So we'll be piloting some of these things over the next year or two and really look at just better and more efficient ways to move people and goods.
Because I think for the land border crossings, when we think beyond commercial, but tourism and commuters for the most part have their Nexus cards. But for tourism in a place like Niagara, for example, that can present some pretty practical problems. The biometric collection, I know the earlier experiments on biographic have worked very, very well. But Solomon, you made, as did some others, references to artificial intelligence. Are you aware of any effort made in any kind of joint public, private, and academic partnership to bring specialists in AI together on both sides of the border who can give their advice or their sense of things to officials on either side of the border?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an emerging area in terms of being able to take big data, be able to link together different pieces of information, and use algorithms not to necessarily replace what an officer does, but provide decision enablers. And I think there's a lot of good work that can be had there. But to my earlier comments on you know, duplication itself. And I think we've heard from our panel as well that you take an environment where I reside in terms of the Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle corridor, and you have an international visitor coming in, going across the border multiple times, possibly going up on a cruise ship to Alaska. I think our current mode of doing one transaction at a time, whether you're going northbound, southbound, I think AI has a role to be able to stitch that story together for both crossings into Canada, crossings into the United States, to be able to help decision enable the kinds of risk management that will evolve in terms of helping to support two-nation vacations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we should go to questions, if we may. We have time for some brief questions. This person on the far side.
Hello, Daniel Gooch from the Canadian Airports Council. I've been struck by the speed with which CBP has been able to move into piloting the facial recognition in various modes and looking at different functions. For our colleagues on the Canadian side, a two-part question. The known ID thing, it's exciting to see Canada at the leadership of that. I'm wondering to what extent, if any, will facial be a part of that work, and how actively engaged on facial we are here in Canada?
Up there in Canada.
Crossing the border was so seamless, he didn't realize he'd done so.
So I'll just comment on the known travel digital identity piece for a moment, and Tina may have a comment on the facial recognition. So yes, absolutely, facial recognition will be a part of that. And just for clarity, it will be blockchain technology along with cryptography as well. So it will include things like facial recognition, quite a long list of additional kinds of information that will be used for the traveler across the continuum, but will be integrated into the other systems that already exist. And that's why we're doing a government-to-government agreement, because to be able to connect the way that Ellen was talking about, so you really have a seamless system. So in the future, you could actually have a North American kind of assessment done, regardless of where you are. So connecting into those other systems like CBSA and immigration are also a critical component of this, where that information would be shared, and you would have that actual database feed that would happen almost instantaneously in terms of that sharing of information. On the facial recognition, I don't know if Tina has a comment on that from a border perspective.
So I would say that we're not as advanced as our neighbors to the south are in terms of facial biometrics, but it is definitely an area that we are super keen to explore. And I made reference to, in the context of Five Eyes, I think there is a real desire and a commitment to come up with a standard approach within that community. And obviously from a North American perspective, we see this as a critical area to move into. I just want to, though, pick up on the question, Paul, or the comment that you made around, collection authorities. We do have at this point some legal impediments around exit. We're still, there is a piece of legislation that, needs to move through and be, receive royal assent that would allow us to do full kind of entry-exit. More exit than entry. I mean, we do entry now, but I mean, to get the authority to do complete exit, which again, would help us move forward in terms of, that sort of sharing. And from a land border perspective, I mean, we are already doing some sharing of information because, your exit is our entry and vice versa. But I mean, as you move more aggressively into the space of facial biometric collection, it is something that, we're very conscious from a bilateral perspective. If you want to harmonize and be aligned, you want to be doing, maybe not identical, but very similar and comparable.
Thank you. Teresa?
Tina, you started on the question I was going to ask, because this is a policy panel. So I was going to ask about, aside from resources, what are some of the policy impediments to some of these visions that you have been talking about? and you mentioned obviously on the Canadian side, John, or anyone else from the U.S. side, what are sort of still some of the policy decisions, either legislative or regulatory, that you may need, or do you feel like you have all the necessary pieces in place? It's just a matter of coordination, technology, and resources.
I would say that, legislative, as I mentioned, we still have some limitations, but there's plans in place. It's just a question of, getting over the hurdles and getting legislation passed. Well, I was going to say, I think in some ways we do have an easier time of it, but it's still, there's lots of legislation that the government wants to advance, and sometimes there's, the desire and appetite exceeds the amount of time that might be available before end of mandate. But that said, I think, the entry-exit legislation continues to be, a priority for our minister, for example. So I think, there's some legislation, and coupled with legislation is often, regulatory work that needs to be done too. And so, you kind of need one and the second proceeds. So without the first step, it's hard to move to the second. I think the other reality is privacy considerations, as I mentioned earlier. Those are issues that are extremely important to our government, and we do need to make sure that privacy by default is the standard by which we look at all of the initiatives that we wish to pursue. But that doesn't mean they're easy, and often they take some time and thought to push through them. And then the other reality is, as you're moving into the world of technology, there is a cost associated with that. So while we might not have money to I guess whatever the number was, Solomon, that you put up there of the number of new officers, we also have to make choices around where we're making investments from a technological perspective. But it's really great when you're living next to somebody who's already out of the gate on, some of these technologies, and will have learned lessons that can be shared. And so by the time we get to the point where we're able to actually jump on that bandwagon, it's a pretty clear sense of where we want to go. So it's, there's some limitations, but I wouldn't say they're insurmountable.
We have time for a brief comment. Sure.
Very quick comment as well. And I think one of the unsung stories of Beyond the Border from 2011, we focus a lot on the new preclearance agreement. Great benefits there, good things, but we often forget that in December 2012, Canada and U.S. signed a fairly expansive immigration sharing agreement. And there are some ingredients that are untapped there that could help deal with some of the things that may otherwise be barriers to thinking about the things that we want to accomplish together.
Thank you, Solomon. A very quick question, please, because we're really biting into our next discussion, in all fairness to our group.
Diana Negroponte from the Wilson Center. I'd like the panel to address the issue of over-collection of biometric and information. In the United States, we have offenses which at the state level are a concern, but are not at the federal level. I'm thinking of a DUI within a state, not necessarily reflected in the federal, but which is captured as the transition across the border occurs. I'm thinking of marijuana possession, admissible at the state level, not necessarily at the federal level. How are you making the distinction between federal offenses and state offenses when it comes to border transfers?
Sure. I mean, it gets back to our federal immigration authorities and regulations, where, yes, state infractions may render a person inadmissible. So both really have a play in determining a person's admissibility under your immigration requirements.
No other comment? Thank you very, very much for your questions and your participation this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you.
So my term paper will be
You'll share?
absolutely. I gotta stress myself that I write this. That's my design on the known traveler digital identity.
Nice to meet you. Reaching over.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've covered a lot of territory today, back and forth across the border many, many times. A lot of real estate in terms of history, Great Wall of China, Treaty of Westphalia, and talking about the northern border of the future. But I want to be sure to give our partners in this beyond pre-clearance endeavor the last word today. So the Vancouver International Airport and the Public Policy Forum of Ottawa will be having our last words. Jerry Bruno of YVR, together with Solomon Wong of Intervistas, we've heard from earlier, but they've been our partners since last fall in organizing today's forum and indeed the broader coalition of stakeholders and sponsors for the Beyond Pre-Clearance White Paper and the Strategic Policy Initiative. And Jane Hooker, who is here representing the Public Policy Forum, partnering with us from Ottawa. She's actually from New Zealand. And so if there's anyone here from Australia, I think that covers all 5 of the eyes, right? Jerry has become a great friend the 3 years that I worked in Vancouver, and certainly over the last several months working together to organize and pull off this forum today. He really has, in abundance, what has been called the vision thing. Jerry is really a strategic thinker who's been a key player for many years in aviation, in passenger facilitation, and also in security. Going back to the Canada-U.S. Open Skies Agreement in 1995, moving forward to the in-transit pre-clearance work that he did, transit without visa, CAN-PASS, the 2001 pre-clearance agreement, the perimeter clearance strategy in 2002, and automated border clearance. So Jerry, please come up. And then Jane Hooker, here representing the Public Policy Forum in Ottawa, who is herself a fellow from New Zealand working in Canada this year. Please come up and take a few minutes to talk about what comes next in our partnership.
Well, thank you, Lynn. We worked very closely together to put this on, and I think we can feel pretty good about the outcome today. We've heard some fantastic presentations, a lot of information, and I think a lot of thoughts on where we go from here. I spoke earlier this morning and said I was going to talk a bit more about our Beyond Pre-Clearance coalition and initiative and where we go. But before I do, there's 3 things I got out of today, because one of my early comments this morning was that, I felt that, we had a lot of unfinished business yet after the Beyond the Border initiative kind of went dormant, and it's good to know that I'm not alone, and I think a lot of people, we heard this throughout the day, that there is a need to get back to the table and start moving on the next stage. The second thing I mentioned was that I was hoping that out of today's discussions we would get enough material to populate a few chapters out of the new Beyond Pre-Clearance paper, the white paper that's going to be written, and I think we have ample material. I think there's a lot of fantastic ideas. And the third thing I got out of it is we seem to have a collective common vision that we all want a virtual border and virtual security. Nobody wants to feel like they've been looked at, interrogated, searched, and there are different ways of doing it. And we've heard a lot of good ideas on how we can approach that, whether it's known traveler identity, facial biometrics, and having background information on the passenger. So I think this is a great start. I'm going to go into see if this works. Am I doing it upside down? Okay. Nothing has happened. I turned it off. Help. Do we have any? Maybe you can click it. I don't know why it's not moving here. Okay, so to start talking a little bit about our Beyond Preclearance Coalition, we do have a plan, and we're already implementing it. First of all was establish the coalition between January and April. I'm happy to say that I think we've established a coalition. We're partway there, and I'll talk a bit more about who the members are and where we're going. Second initiative was to set up a website, beyondpreclearance.com, and it is up and running, or .org, I guess it is. So anyone who's looking for more information beyond what I'm going to present today, you're welcome to access the website. We will be populating it with more information as we go. Hopefully even some of today's presentations we'll be able to put on the website. We're appointing a steering committee, executive committees from our coalition members. And again, we talked about using this forum today and other vehicles for stakeholder input. The white paper is going to be drafted between May and the end of August, with the intention of publishing a final report that we hope to distribute and share on a broad basis to a lot of the stakeholders and definitely both governments. The next. Okay, thank you. So associated events today, this was the start, and we talked earlier that this is not a one-time thing. This is really the beginning of a long process. Our coalition members, we've talked about a 3-year initiative, which will include public policy roundtables in May and June, and Jane is going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. Vancouver Airport, we are having our second Aviation Border Summit in September 13th and 14th. And I'm pleased that a lot of the speakers today have already volunteered to come to that summit and actually present. The focus will be the aviation component of the white paper, because it is an Aviation Border Summit that we are going to host. Now, there are other border conferences, some of which are already partners of ours. Canada Border Trade Alliance. We're speaking in May in Ottawa, and we will be talking about this initiative. But in October, when they have their conference in D.C., again, the white paper will be published, and they will cover a lot of the land border components. PNWR, Pacific Northwest Economic Region, they have a conference coming up in June. I actually spoke at their conference in October in Victoria, and that's where they immediately agreed to become members of our coalition. And then in November in Whitehorse. There's also a Canada-U.S. border conference in September in Detroit, and they've already agreed that they're going to have a panel session on our Beyond Preclearance initiative. So there's a lot of activities that are coming forward. These are our coalition members and partners, Vancouver Airport, which kind of started this process. Obviously, Woodrow Wilson Center, Canada Institute, a key partner, Public Policy Forum, and Intervistas Consulting, who is taking on the lion's share of writing the white paper. Pacific Northwest Economic Region, I've mentioned. ACI North America. Kevin Burke spoke earlier today, and their members. Greater Toronto Airport Authority, Canadian American Border Trade Alliance, Winnipeg Airport Authority, Canadian Airports Council, WestJet, Calgary Airport Authority, Tourism Industry Association of Canada, the National Airline Council, and Canadian Chamber of Commerce. By the end of April, I'm going to have 2 slides with the rest of our sponsors and coalition members. We're actually in discussions with Cruise Line Industry Association, U.S. Travel Association, and a number of ports and railroads and other organizations. So we're very optimistic that by the end of April, we're going to double our membership. And I think it's important to have as broad-based a coalition as possible, because the more we have involved, I think the more we'll be listened to, the more effective our voice will be when we talk to our government officials. Did I turn it off again? Thank you. Let's try this again. Here we go. So these are contact names on the screen. Myself, Solomon Wong, Alana Lawrence, Lynn, of course, and Ben from Woodrow Wilson, and Jane Hooker, her boss, Edward Greenspan, and others. But as I said, there is the website, info@beyondpreclearance.org. We'll put you in touch with any one of us if you're interested in getting more information on this initiative and where we go next. Thank you very much. It's been a great day, and look forward to seeing a lot of you in Vancouver in September.
Thanks very much, Jerry. Wanted to start off today by just thanking Lynn and everyone else who have put together such a wonderful event today. I think certainly from my discussions around the room, it seems like everyone's really enjoyed it. We've learnt a lot, and I'm really pleased that the Public Policy Forum will be able to carry on this conversation as well. So we're really happy to partner with the Wilson Centre's Canada Institute and Vancouver International Airport on this project. For those of you who don't know the Public Policy Forum, we are an Ottawa-based, independent, non-partisan, non-profit organisation. We build bridges among participants in the policy-making process. For more than 30 years now, we've been giving people a platform to examine the issues, offer new perspectives, and feed fresh ideas into the policy discussions. The Public Policy Forum believes that good policy is critical to making a better Canada. Our work at the Public Policy Forum covers a range of different public policy issues, and we're excited to be a part of this project. In today's increasingly globalised world, in a time of disruption on many fronts, the effective management of the border is crucial to both our country's prosperity, and we've certainly heard all the statistics today to back that up. We believe that these issues deserve the attention and focus of our decision makers, and we're pleased to see so many of you here today. The Public Policy Forum is taking the next step in this discussion to Canada, and we'll be bringing key players together for 2 roundtable discussions in May and June. The first of these roundtables will focus on the global context for border policy, and we've heard today a few people mention the importance of the global context. With the growth in global supply chains, with the economic opportunities that are available through increased trade, as well as international issues like human trafficking, illegal migration, and the importance of international cooperation that a number of speakers have mentioned, border policy needs to take account of the global context. This first roundtable will explore the issues and opportunities for border policy raised by expanding relationships and trade in all directions around the world. The second roundtable will explore further the new technologies that have the potential to revolutionise how people and goods cross the border. We've heard about some of these exciting new technologies today, and certainly some of the issues that are raised by them as well. This roundtable is going to explore in particular the implications related to the use of these technologies in the border management context. So for example, we're hoping to look at issues around privacy, which has certainly come up today, sovereignty, the potential of creating 2-tiered systems, and risks around cybersecurity, among other issues. We were really keen to look at how we can mitigate the risks so that everyone can benefit from these technological innovations. So we hope that we'll see some of you at our upcoming roundtable discussions that are north of the border. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for those of you who have been with us from the beginning this morning. I just want to close by saying that these days there's a great temptation in public discourse to be really cynical about the role of government in solving problems. But after a day like today, when we have seen people from the private sector working with folks who are on the front lines doing the government's work at both the Canadian and American borders, when we've seen people who have given themselves for years to looking at issues of transportation and innovation over U.S. borders and Canadian borders, when you see the way that people can come together from public to private, from north to south, to work on these issues together and to move forward toward new and very pragmatic kinds of solutions. I don't know. I don't think this is a time for cynicism. I'm pretty darn optimistic that we're going to continue to be able to harness technology that's available now, innovation that's available now, and do something better in the border of the future. The back of my business card, for those of you who don't have one of my business cards, has kind of a mission statement for the Wilson Center: tackling global issues through independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas. I think all of you would agree with me that we have gone a long way towards showing exactly why organizations like the Wilson Center add value in democracies. And we're really excited to be working with colleagues in the public sector, in both governments, with colleagues like Vancouver Airport, like InterVistas, like the sponsors whose names you saw up here on the splash screen, and with other public policy research organizations like the Public Policy Forum of Ottawa. We have a lot of great work that we can do together. So thank you all very much for coming. I want to finally close with a shout out to my colleagues from the Canada Institute and the Wilson Center who made this day possible. Ben Proctor, where are you, Ben? Here he is, new father, sleep deprived, but still here earlier than most of you. Savannah Boylan, who was here even before I was this morning. Sasha Chuchin, our extraordinary intern from Carleton University. Maria Stella Gatsoulis, Narmada Variam, Aureo Mesquita, Jim Dickmeyer, our boss, tuning in from St. Petersburg, where she said it wasn't that great a day to go to the beach anyway, Laura Dawson. Thanks to my colleagues from the Canada Institute and from the Wilson Center for making this possible. And with that, we are adjourned.